Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing in our journey through the Daodejing. Currently, we are in chapter 43, or excuse me, 44. So let me go ahead and share a screen. And we'll just jump right in here. So chapter 44. Fame or self, which matters more? That's kind of an interesting one. I was just reading recently some books on business and different challenges you have with that, and one of the areas that was focusing a lot on is the issue of integrity, and he really boils the integrity down to how we adhere to a set of core values and our actions. Do they match up with that? And so often we get in situations where we are tempted to go against what our core values are in order to reach some other end. And especially, I think, in like political situations, and I don't mean just in the sense of like politics, but in terms of like internal, groups or corporations where there's different dynamics in play, where we can feel that temptation to compromise with that integrity. But I think it also comes into play when we think about how do we achieve our goals. And so much of how we achieve our goals in our current cultural context has to do with, that positions of authority or notoriety. And so this idea of fame and reputation comes into play. And this can be both a positive and a negative. So fame here is coming from the word technically for name, but it's using name how we sometimes use it, as in reputation. So our reputation, our fame, our position, do these things are how do they compare when we think about who we are as a person or as a self? Which of them actually matters more? How often do we actually make detrimental changes to who we are, let's say physically as a person, in order to try and reach these other goals or these aspirations, which may be very detrimental to who we are physically? You guys ever run into those challenges within your own life where you're tempted to maybe not get enough sleep or maybe compromise on some things you think are important in order to reach those particular goals that you have for yourself or that other people have for you?
I've
Yes.
I've been
I,
around the block enough times to know that uh, if I try to ignore those things, the result is always highly predictable. So
Yeah.
yes, I've done it. I've tried to do it enough times to know it doesn't work.
Jazz, were you going to say something else?
yeah, I've got like a simple example of like this week is a good example. I've been very busy with work, and when I get focused on my work, I tend to ignore other needs in my life. And one of those needs is, food. And my wife is constantly reminding me to take some time away and get some lunch and take a breather and step away from it. So I totally get that.
Yeah, it's easy, right? And it can feel like those other goals we're trying to reach are so important. And it's not to say that they're not important, but it's always this interesting juggling act where we think for sure, yeah, of course, my physical self is very important, because without that, how could I even do these other things? But frequently, we wrestle with this, chasing after these other values. Another area where the value question comes into play is with wealth, because again, we can look at how we achieve these goals that we have. Maybe it's, how do we have more time with the family or for personal endeavors or even just a sense of not feeling like you're always underwater, or just being able to relax once in a while. The pursuit of wealth is, with at least within our culture, one of the primary ways you can achieve those things. So again, we get into the question of, how much are we willing to sacrifice in terms of self in order to achieve these things that will help bring us wealth? Ultimately, the idea is that if we have those things, then we're going to have in the future a better opportunity for how we can actually care for or take care of the self. Very difficult situation to navigate sometimes, especially when we don't have even those basic needs met. It can really be something that pushes us very far out of balance. And then an interesting question: gain or loss? Which causes us more pain? Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
Weight gain causes more pain.
What do you say, Dwayne?
I said weight gain causes more pain.
Weight. Now, is that in terms of becoming enlightened, or is that in terms of just waking up in the morning?
Oh, weight, like as in gaining more weight.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. But it could be the opposite for someone like Chaz who doesn't eat enough. So
Yeah, loss. Like I feel like, Dwayne, you have a great point. Gain or loss, like it could be good or bad on either side.
Hmm.
So I feel like you can't really answer this question without more context.
Well, I mean, we have some context here, right? So we're talking about this idea of reputation, and we're talking about this idea of wealth. So if we are gaining in our fame or our reputation, if we're gaining in our wealth, is that a painful thing, or is losing our reputation or losing our wealth something that causes more pain?
Well, you could be losing yourself.
Well, and that's the question, right? So if we gain with fame or wealth and it comes at the expense of self, right, then we've got kind of a gain and a loss at the same time. One of the other things we might consider is, as we achieve more things or gain more things, then we have more responsibilities too, right? So let's say we have achieved a certain level of status where we've got the kind of job that gives us an income where now we can maybe get that next level house or that next level car. And all of a sudden we've got this bigger mortgage, or we've got this bigger, payment we've got to make on our car, which makes us more dependent on this job that doesn't give us as much flexibility. If the market changes, or if we, get downsized as a business, now find ourselves in a bit of a bind, maybe more of a bind than we would have been before, because we have increased that level of cost of living that makes us less flexible in terms of what we can do in terms of, let's say, making money. But then we can also think about how much, once we get something, let's say wealth or possessions, now we've got a whole concern about how do we hold on to these things? How do we keep from losing them? And if we do lose them, how much more dramatic does that feel? It's kind of interesting. Gaining is not necessarily always a positive thing, because it can put us into a very negative space. Anybody have some thoughts or experiences with that?
Not with fame or wealth necessarily. But I think on the other side, like losing certain things, but I've experienced it as a benefit, like how gain isn't always a good thing. Loss can sometimes be a good thing. And there are a few things in my life that I've lost that were good losses.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it can be a challenge on both sides, and it can also be a blessing on both sides. So it's hard to say. It's just kind of depends on, like you said, the context and how these things come into play. But I think the key thing that they're trying to bring up here is it's not always necessarily a positive thing, especially within the context that we're looking at in terms of fame or reputation and the idea of wealth, that gaining that can sometimes be as painful as if we go through the process of losing it. Yeah. Hey, Joni, welcome.
Good morning, guys.
It's good to see you.
Good morning.
Good to see you.
So, if we continue then, those who are attached to things will suffer greatly. So, this is a lot of different wisdom traditions touch on this aspect of the idea of attachment and how that's going to impact the way we experience life. So if there's one thing that we've been seeing a lot as we've been going through the Daodejing, is this idea that everything is constantly changing, that there's this yin yang that, at one time we may have an abundance and at other times we may have a lack. And often these things will turn into each other. So we may go from a position of having much and then it suddenly finds ourselves in the opposite and vice versa. So the more we are attached to the different things in our life or even people, then there's the possibility that that comes with a great deal of suffering as well. So if the counsel is to be careful about our attachments, sometimes this goes, I think, a little too far to the idea that we want to not have any attachments. And I don't think that's actually possible. Sometimes this is actually tied in with the idea of desires, not having any desires. Again, if we didn't have certain desires, we would be in serious trouble, like not eating when it's time to eat or getting sleep, right? Or even trying to fix something that's problematic. So there are legitimate needs that people have that we can be without, that we need to be motivated to how do we actually achieve those things. So it's not about not having desires or not having attachments, period. It's more about how do we have an appropriate desires or appropriate attachments to things. And especially if we're thinking socially, humans are very much social creatures. So we need to have these attachments and recognize our attachments or really our interdependence with one another. But again, those can become out of balance, where maybe we've become in more of a dependency type of a situation with someone as opposed to more of a healthy, mutually beneficial types of relationships. And there'll be times when those things are different. When obviously we're children, we're heavily dependent on our parents. And as we get much older, we may find ourselves actually more dependent on our children or other caregivers. So it's not to say that there aren't times when we find ourselves in that necessarily. But in general, we want to be looking at more of this balanced approach to how we see our attachments to others as well as things. You guys have any thoughts on this concept?
I do.
Go for it.
It's almost like we need to wisely choose our pain because our gains are going to bring us pain too. A lot of times, everything has an expiration date, including ourselves and our loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so that just brought to mind that, and you just explaining attachments aren't necessarily bad, and it's almost impossible not to get attached if you have a kid, right? Like I'm pregnant with a baby right now, so
Congratulations.
yay, thank you. We're so excited, but it is an odd feeling to know that he's coming to a world, and that is hard, and he will have an expiration date too, and that's hard, and scary, right? but it's worth my while. So this just brought to mind, choosing our pains that will bring us fulfillment and meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And those and to maintain the balance there, which means that we stay responsible for ourselves and not to rely on others.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's it's not a bad thing for parents to be attached to their children, or children to be attached to their parents, and other people, our spouses or other close friends, or but we have to very much keep in mind, as you're saying, Joni, this idea. I like how you said we all have an expiration date, and we don't know when that is, right? It could be soon, it could be late. But whatever it is, how do we experience that time in between? And when we do have to face those times of loss, which we all will, if we've maintained a quality type of an attachment, then it's going to be a very different process we go through in terms of that grieving process. It's not that we are going to be able to avoid the idea of grief, but some people we see are utterly devastated by that to the point where they do not recover from it, and that's not healthy either, right? So there's always this way of the more we can understand this correct relationship between things, that it doesn't mean that life's going to be easy or without pain or without challenge, but we will be able to be more resilient and be able to navigate these changes in a more robust way.
Yeah, one thing with that is you know that you've given it your best, energy, your attention and interest to that relationship. Say that we're talking about that, right? And losing a loved one. I feel like I would feel a lot better if they were to pass away, that I could look back and see, wow, like we had a really fulfilling relationship, and that person really was a part of my life instead of just coasting like we usually do. So I can see that.
Yeah. And I think if we think back to some of the previous statements where it's talking about the quest for things like our fame or our reputation and the idea of wealth, that sometimes these can put our mindset into something in the future, so that everything is like, well, as soon as I get here, then we'll be able to have the time for that relationship, or then we'll be able to have that time for whatever needs to happen. And it puts off our experience of life to something that we're trying to get to, instead of recognizing that we experience it every day in every moment. And the more we become aware of experiencing it in that moment, like you said, Joni, the better we're going to feel about the time that we did have, whatever it is, with those ones that we care about. Yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts?
To me, I'm thinking more about literal things like headphones or, whatever items you cherish. And if you're attached to those things, I mean, items especially can go missing or break or, expire in their own way. And you have to be able to just accept that, honestly, because if you can't, then you're going to have trouble with change in a lot of other aspects of your life where, maybe it is a person. And if you're attached to an item and you're having trouble letting go of an item, then what happens when you lose a person in your life? And I think it's better to just think about, you lived before it, you'll live after it, and it'll be okay. You don't need it.
Yeah.
Those are my sense. Two or less.
Thinking of possessions brings to mind, I knew this guy who told a story about when he was a kid, and he was upset with his mom, and he wanted to hurt her, so he smashed her bong. Because he knew she would very attached to and be very upset by that. And I think about how people who use bongs, glass bongs, they always break eventually, and then they get very upset. But whenever I have that happen, I always think, oh, well, that was going to break eventually. I guess it was just its time to go, and it never bothers me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny.
That is a funny story, Dane. I have one more thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm talking a lot.
No worries.
Does this correlate to status? So let's say the housing market is terrible right now. You know, let's just say that for pretense, but it really is so bad. And we would love to own a home. And it seems that I have weighed a lot of almost value in myself on not being able to own a home yet. And that may be an attachment or desire for a home, but it's almost more just like a status, or, you know, I'd love to invite people over to a home that I own, right? So I'm just curious if that correlates here too.
Yeah, I think that, you know, if we go back to some of the points here, you know, we've got this idea of reputation, which could have this idea of status in terms of what types of things do we have, or what kind of possessions do we have that we can invite people to and feel like we have something to offer in that regard. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something over the top either, right? It can be just a very modest type of a home. But when even those basic things are feeling like they're outside of our reach, then this is where we can struggle, because how much are we going to sacrifice self in order to try and attain these goals? And the question is always, well, where does this fall, I think, on the question of need versus other types of maybe socially constructed desires, that this is what it means to be successful. This is what it means to have done well. And that can drive us sometimes in directions that are not necessarily congruent with self, but depending on what types of social influences that we're having, these can be very impactful on driving that need for that reputation or that wealth in order to achieve those socially constructed ideals. So yeah, we definitely have to keep those in mind. And I think, again, this idea of gain or loss, which causes more pain, we have to also be aware of, yes, I've got maybe this desire, I'm chasing after, this pretty house with the white picket fence. But now let's say I get it and I've got this mortgage, and now I find myself maybe in somewhat of a trap, because now I can't be as flexible with, what my job options are or something like that, because I've got this mortgage and now I'm at risk of potentially losing that. So then we get back into that attachment question. So it's always this thing where we have to figure out, how do we get this balance between these things? So then it continues and it says, those who save will suffer heavy losses. So this is interesting, right? I mean, how much of our culture is built on this idea of, we've got to save for retirement, we've got to save for rainy days, we've got to have these backup resources. I was intrigued by a quote that I've heard before. It came up in a TV show again the other day, but it was something to the effect, I guess it was an Eskimo saying that was something along the lines of, the best place to store your excess meat, let's say if you're a hunter, is in your neighbor's bellies. And the idea here is, obviously, if you just try to hoard it for yourself, ultimately you can't do much with it because you can only eat so much, right? But there's going to be potentially a time when you don't do as well. Maybe the hunting is harder. And if you have been generous with the things that you have and you've filled the bellies of those around you, then there's this idea of reciprocation, right? That they're going to remember you maybe when they do well and you're having a hard time. And this is a very different way of thinking about, in a sense, social security, if we want to use that in more of a literal sense, that when we recognize the connections with others in our community, we have a different kind of way of looking out for each other, whereas our current culture is extremely individualistic in the way that it's organized, so that everything is about, I have to be able to care for myself. Even if we think about, like, as our parents get older, as we get older, we have a really unique way of addressing that in our culture that's entirely different than it's ever been in human history, in that our seniors are expected to care for themselves and that they are extremely concerned about not becoming a burden on their children, which has never been that way in the course of human history. It's always been that the obligation of the children was to care for their parents when they had that need. And so here, instead of looking to our community and each other and how we develop these strong connections so that we can help each other through the different storms that happen in life, it's all focused on, how do I take care of myself? How do I make sure I'm not a burden on other people or not dependent on other people? But the reality is, we all are, even in our system where we feel like we're very individualized. How our whole economic system works is very much dependent on everybody else as well. And we see this when things happen to the economic market. Everybody is affected by it. And so we've maybe created a little bit more of a separation between how these connections work with each other. We've made it more anonymous, in that we pay into kind of a centralized system, and that centralized system has the ability to offer help and whatnot, but it's anonymous, which is a very different way of connecting with each other than when it's a face-to-face type of a thing. If we're in community and we know that we're dependent on each other, we don't have the ability to, be as obnoxious, let's say, to one another. If you're a hunter-gatherer band, let's say back before we had our current world of managing things, you can't exist as an individual. You depend on the community, and the community depends on you, which is going to really change the types of interactions that you have with each other. When we feel like we're just individuals, then there can be this sense that I don't need to think about how I'm treating other people. And often our quest for wealth is, how do we break free from those attachments so that I don't have to be as concerned or care about what other people think? It's a very interesting, and I think socially destructive, way that we've tried to structure things around more of an individualistic way of approaching things. But it's also the case that we do have, we're constantly juggling between personal needs and group needs, and how do we manage these? And it's a never-ending cycle of working through that. But here, I think we can look at a couple of different things. If we are focused on more of an individualistic approach, then we are looking to, how do we have that wealth? How do we have that fame and fortune, or that reputation that allows us to be, in a sense, unattached from the interdependencies that we have on other people, but we become more attached to things. So the attachment shifts from, how do I build strong community, to how do I have enough resources for myself, which comes into this idea of the saving, or we might even think of this in terms of hoarding. But then all kinds of things can happen, right? It could be, I've saved up for this house, I've got everything invested in it, and I live in Southern California and a forest fire comes through and takes it away. Or it could just be something as simple as, I got in a car accident and now I'm injured and I can't work, and I end up losing all the stuff that I had, or any kind of illness, right? There's all kinds of changes that can happen that can strip away all those connections in terms of things that we've tried to hoard or gather, or the attachments that we have, in order to allow this more of individualistic existence that we'll find ourselves right back in a situation of being more dependent, or at least recognizing our interdependence on other people. It's a very interesting challenge we find in our modern culture.
Yeah, it's very interesting too, because, sorry, yeah, I do have thoughts. I feel like in today's world, especially, like we do compare a lot to, like, oh, the hunter-gatherer times, and it's easier to think of these things during those times because we didn't have technology. And I feel like technology now, is social media and everything, is making everybody feel like they're all an individual and they all deserve wealth and fame and attention. And it makes it really hard for us to have this mindset of only looking in your neighbor's bowl to see if it's full, instead of, comparing and saying, no, I need to be better. I need to be better than them. And it's hard to translate this into today, I feel like, because of that. Like, everybody is so isolated and not, you know, bringing brownies to their neighbors when they move into a new neighborhood. They're more like peeking out their blinds, like, oh, they're doing this weird thing, or like, I can't go out there because they're taking their trash out and I don't want to have to talk to them. Like things like that. So it's hard to translate this, I guess, into, today, and think of it in a way that we think of it as like the hunter and gatherer time.
Yeah, and for sure, even with the within the Daodejing, they're not anticipating going back to something like that either, right? But I think that there's definitely something about this indigenous wisdom that they are holding on to, that they're trying to remind us of. And how do we take these important concepts and bring them into play, even in our modern context? And there's a lot of different ways that people have attempted to do this, right? Where we see at different points different attempts to move into more, let's say, intentional communities, where they try to develop more of this neighborliness and more of a community way of approaching life, as opposed to individuals where everybody else is our competition. And we even see with a lot of different religious traditions where they try to foster more of this idea of community. We end up with a bit of kind of tribalism at some points because of this, where it's, our group versus their group. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I used to think that the issue was we had to figure out how to get everybody into the same tribe. But really, I think our ability to connect is limited. We can't be 100% connected with everybody, but there's a finite number of people that we can really be connected to. And what's more important than trying to get everybody into the same tribe is, how do we make space for the different tribes? How do we have allowances for differences that we can see as beneficial instead of a threat? And maybe this is another extremely big challenge in our world today, is it's really focused on this idea of conformity. How do I get everybody else to my side and to be like I am, as opposed to more of an approach of harmony, where we see the differences actually contributing to something bigger and better than any of the groups are by themselves. So yeah, it's going to be a struggle for us as maybe outliers in a world that's really focused on individualism. How do we develop more of a sense of community so that we can start to think about our attachments, think about how we're dealing with our material goods in a different way? And I suspect that there's going to be more people out there who are eager for something where life is more connected, because a lot of us are feeling just completely overwhelmed and stressed out by having to try and figure everything out for ourselves. It's not the way that we're supposed to be.
Yeah, it's like thinking about community. It's so hard to find a community now, I feel like, that isn't just like, oh, it's online, like join a Discord, join a Facebook group. It's not the same as
Yeah.
like having an in-person community, really. And especially like Joni, I'm sure you're aware, like having a kid, and you know, you used to be able to hand it off to somebody else for a little while. And now when you have a kid, it's like it's you, you know, like unless you have a really close family or a really close set of friends around you,
Mhm.
it's going to be a lot harder now than I feel like it used to be. That's just my perception. I don't know how it used to be, but from what I hear, it's different.
Well, you could always just make other people feel slightly uncomfortable and give them the kid for a
It's
minute
true.
and just wake people up out of their
Here you go.
self-involved world.
Oh,
Yeah, thankfully I live close to family, so
good. I
um
don't. So I'm like,
oh,
if I
it's
had a kid,
hard.
like that's it.
Yeah,
It's the
that is
end for me. No sleeping. Mm,
well, you can explore the people around you and
yeah.
who takes the
Hey,
who can
neighbor.
handle it.
Yeah.
This brought to mind too, something I've been learning is um I have always had an unconscious purpose to control,
Mm.
and I'm learning how to have a conscious purpose to understand, because controlling and like this idea of hoarding, right? Like it's this very constrictive viewpoint. Whereas if I can start to understand and, you know, maybe I can consider that I'm not the center of the universe. We can consider that. um, then like you said, Jim, if I'm seeking understanding, asking questions to really discover and learn new things about someone or a group of people, then yeah, I think harmony is much more available.
Yeah,
It
I think.
reminds me of this great scene from Ted Lasso, Jim. I think you're familiar,
Mhm.
where he's talking about seeking to understand versus seeking to judge.
Mm.
Joni, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's very cool. Very
Yeah,
cool script.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, if you just look up Ted Lasso, understand versus judge, I'm sure it will come up.
Okay, we'll do.
Yeah, there's when we think about the kind of twin demands that we have to constantly navigate between personal desires and community desires, or you know what those impact on each other are. The more we see how we're kind of dependent and interconnected with other people, in order for us to essentially be who I want to be, it comes with an attempt to try and control others, because a lot of my identity or my freedoms are based on my obligations and connections to those things around me. So we can find ourselves caught in this trap of trying to figure out how to control everything around us so that we can do this thing that we want to do or we feel like we should be able to do, but we really don't have the ability to do that, to control anyone else, right? So our attempts to do so can erupt into very negative patterns of behavior. So being able to recognize our interdependent nature opens up a bit of the possibilities in the sense of letting go of some of that control, but it also means that there's more of a community concern or thought about how we move forward, not just an individual concern. And again, our culture super focuses on, you know, individual concerns, and it makes it very difficult for us to navigate these group demands that we all have, and rightfully so. As social creatures, we need to recognize those things. I wrestle a lot with the idea of freedom, because what does that actually mean? Does that mean that I'm free not to care what other people think of me, or I'm free not to think about how my actions have an impact on somebody else? You know, I don't know that that's actually what we want to do. I think it's more of a recognizing again that interdependence, and that everything we do is going to impact other people. And so we should use some wisdom in thinking about what we do, because there is no way to do something that doesn't impact somebody else. It's just not a possibility. But it can feel like an impossible bind at times.
That's
And
hard too. I feel like there's an element of balance with that because you also don't want to run yourself over trying to make other people happy,
yes,
which happens to me a lot.
yeah, there's the boundaries that come into play because, again, thinking about that self, if we haven't got a self, then there is nothing to give. There is nothing to contribute or participate in if our self is gone. So there's, again, it's not about one or the other, but how do we navigate this balance? How do we navigate that yin yang so that everything has a place, but within a range that allows for win-win situations whenever possible? So again, continue then and say, those who are contented are never disappointed. So that's an interesting topic that comes up several times in the Daodejing, this idea of contentment. And how do we get there? So if we find ways to actually be content with the things that we do have, or whatever our situation brings, then this idea of disappointment, in a very real sense, kind of disappears. Because if it's about this getting more and more because I'm worried about the future or trying to get something else, and that changes, that disappears, then of course there's that disappointment. Or if I'm trying to achieve this level of success, but I can't quite get there, then there's, that gain part, then, that also can be disappointing. But if we find ways to actually be content with who we are and what we have and what our particular station in life is at the moment, then that changes a great deal in terms of how we experience this idea of disappointment. And he's going to say then, those who know when to stop do not find themselves in trouble. And so maybe this is speaking to your point, Taylor, about what are those boundaries? Maybe there's going to be these requests that come on us, and maybe those requests are unrealistic because other people are thinking from more of an individualistic perspective and they're just out to get, and they're not thinking about how their requests are impacting other people. So understanding these boundaries, of what is appropriate and what is inappropriate for other people to ask, and also for what I should do. And then it concludes with the line that if you have figured out how to be contented and how to have boundaries, then, and this is maybe a bit of a hyperbole, they remain forever safe. This isn't like some guarantee that, nothing's ever going to go wrong. And clearly what they're saying is things do change and do go wrong. It's not about how do we have a life where that's not the case, but how do we have a life where, in spite of those things, we meet them with a level of resilience and robustness in terms of emotional equanimity and so forth, that allows us to have a way of experiencing life that is positive in spite of life circumstances.
It's all coming back around to the we'll see farmer
Yes.
every time.
Yes. And that's one of the ways that we do that, right? Is we have to, when we're quick to judging whether something is good or bad that's happened to us, then that's, changing our experience of it, because, oh, a bad thing happened, or, oh, yeah, a good thing happened. But if we withhold that judgment of, is this good or bad, but rather it's just a situation, then it changes that kind of emotional roller coaster that we go through. And because things continuously change, we often see that these situations flip-flop. We thought it was a bad thing, but actually it turned out to be a good thing, right? If we're going to apply the judgments to it. So learning how to hold off on that evaluation from a moral question or a good bad question can also help in that whole process, for sure. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to step through a couple of different things. So one is, if contentment is a positive thing, how do we go about cultivating it in ourselves? And so probably one of the first key things is learning how to be present. or this idea of mindfulness. We can very easily get caught up in terms of being focused on what's coming up next, or what am I trying to do for the future, as well as, what kind of thing did I do in the past? And that can be either a positive thing or a negative thing. It can be the regret that I didn't do these things, or man, that was really good back in the day, when I had all these things. So both directions of thought, either concern or excitement about the future or what the future is going to bring, or regret or excitement about the past, keep us from actually being in the present. And ultimately, going back to Joni's idea that we all come with an expiration date, how we experience life is important in the day-to-day. If it's all being put off to something in the future, or looking back to the glory days, then we don't experience the present moment. And that is truly a waste, because there is no future. We can't go back to the past. There only is what is right now. And if we can't experience right now, then what is there? There isn't anything else. So how do we become more mindful of that and experience as much as we can in the present moment? If we do so, then there is a great deal of, we could say, fulfillment, or maybe fulfillment's not the right word, but there's a great deal of a fullness of experience that isn't waiting for something in the future. It's something that we can have that experience now. And one of the ways we can also look at that is in the present moment, notice the things that we enjoy. I know it's hard to use non-value laden descriptions on things, but there's going to be things that we experience that feel good to us. And we want to really notice those, because our brains are wired to really notice the bad. It's an important trait that we evolved, because if we're out in the bush and we discover a certain snake or spider is dangerous, or we see some type of predator, we need to remember that, and we need to remember it well, so that if we come across this again, we don't forget. And so it's very easy for us to remember negative things. It's a lot harder for us to recall and remember good things. So if we actually take time to savor those things, to recognize we're experiencing something good, then we have more of an ability to imprint that on ourselves in the same way that we imprint the negative things. But we have to be more conscious of it. We have to be more intentional about trying to savor those good moments and those good things when they happen. And the other thing is about simplifying. When we think about the question of contentment with what we have, the opposite of this is, we're not content and we keep on trying to get more. So in simplifying our way of living in terms of the amount of things, or the complexity of the things in our lives, or even the types of food that we try to eat, or there's a lot of different levels you can look at this idea of simplifying, or even sometimes this idea of minimalism can come into play here. But it is the less clutter you have in your life, whether it's things or dysfunctional people or complicated jobs or whatever it is, right? Then the easier it is to be in that moment, to savor those good things, to be present, and it really reduces that need to try and get more. One of the things we've talked about in the past is that negative visualization, where we can take this thing that we have and really take a moment to explore what it would be like if we didn't have that thing, or if it were to break or get lost. And if we can really kind of fully experience that at some point, it resets our adaptation to, I've already had this thing and I've gotten used to it, which helps us to feel like I don't have to get a new one, or I don't have to get the next best thing, because I've learned how to become more appreciative of the thing that I have by really reflecting on what it would be like if I didn't have it. kind of different from reflecting on what would it be like if I had this thing I don't have, right? It's like, what would it be like if I lost this thing I do have? That helps us to be more content and appreciate the stuff that we have. Also, finding a way for us to be able to express ourselves. So we all have different things that really drive us and motivate us, and maybe that's not a part of what we get to do, let's say in our work life. Finding ways that we can express that in other ways is going to be really important, because we want to feel like we're actually engaging our true self. And this could be stuff that we do with other people. It could be like personal hobbies that we have, or writing, or, whatever it is that really gets you excited or motivated about, just getting up in the morning. Having a way to express that is going to be important. If those key values of ourselves are suppressed because we don't feel like we have time or space, or we haven't been authorized or whatever, then we're going to feel very much like we're trying to get somewhere else. And so finding ways, even if it's just as a hobby, to explore these things and have that personal expression is going to be really key to getting to that point of contentment. And then some basic stuff, just moving around, exercise. This is going to be something that helps alleviate stress. It's going to allow us to be more calm. It's going to allow us to have a better clarity on how we're looking at and evaluating our situation. And then also bringing in the concept that Taylor brought up earlier about boundaries, understanding where those limits are in terms of what's appropriate for me to do or not do. I think the other thing we could look at with boundaries is this idea of integrity as well, that if we have these values that are important to us, how do we live them out? And looking at those boundaries on, okay, this might not make me the most successful if I hold true to this value, but maybe I'm going to be happier because I've been authentic to myself, that I'm demonstrating integrity, as opposed to, compromising with myself. Difficult one we have to navigate sometimes, because we can become too uncompromising. And that's also a problem. We need to recognize we don't know everything, and there's stuff for us to learn, and there's values and difference, and that the differences are something that enhance, this idea of that harmony that's possible when there's differences. There's a Chinese proverb that says, if you want to really enhance the flavor of a stew, it's a process of harmony. How do we bring in these different elements and these different spices? But conformity is like trying to flavor water with water, right? It doesn't taste like anything. It's not good. So the differences are important. It adds that spice, that variety to life that's actually a positive thing, not a negative thing. And then couple of comments on when not to be content. There are basic needs we have, right? And if we are, let's say, living on the street, it's not necessarily a good thing to just say, okay, I'm all right with that. I mean, because that's going to be problematic in terms of, our personal health as well. So there are some basic needs that we need to have, food, shelter, freedom from violence. Think about a lot of the war-torn parts of our world today, and other aspects that can be less extreme but still be violent nonetheless, in terms of the company that we find ourselves in, or even destructive relationships. So this isn't a call to find ourselves to be content in all situations. There's things where we do actually need to do something to bring about some change, and those are important to be recognized. And then also being aware of, I think Taylor said, is our neighbor's bowl full? This is a thing that we need to be concerned about as well, because we're not in this by ourselves. We're in it together, and none of us is an island. But again, there's those boundaries. So it can be very easy to get completely consumed by other people's needs. So we always have to figure out, what is that balance between what I can healthfully do and participate in, and maybe strive to make progress, but it's also something we need to recognize it's never completed, right? It's an ongoing concern. So how do we make progress? How do we participate or shape systems to help make things, so that life is experienced as more of a gift by everybody and not just some of those at the top. And maybe as a final thought, this is a kind of a key mental distinction, is that if we're thinking about how do I get to my personal security and safety and well-being, and that is through trying to control everything around me so that I can actually get the things that I need, this idea of wealth and reputation and collecting and hoarding, that's going to be a negative impact on all those around us. But if we can flip that around to see that my personal well-being is actually achieved.
But I still can't eat anything.
What's that, Judy?
So you can't have any solids. You just everything's just smooth, right?
Oh, sorry. I think we got some other sound coming through. Let me go.
Background noise.
Judy here for a second. So there's this idea of kind of turning that around and recognizing, that our collective experience of the good is when we can all participate in that. And then it becomes more about how do we structure systems so that we can mutually benefit as opposed to just individually benefit. A lot of stuff. I know we didn't have a lot of time to kind of explore some of these ideas at the end, but maybe we can explore this a little bit more in future episodes. But
Yeah, this has been one of my favorite ones. It's very actionable.
Oh, good. I'm glad that came across that way for you. I definitely am always intrigued at how much value there is in this very ancient document that really has a lot to speak even to our modern challenges. And yeah, so anyway, I just want to thank everybody for being here today. We'll pick it up again next time. But if you're watching this and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get email invitations to our live Zoom events on Friday mornings, as well as in person if you happen to be in the Southern California area. And look forward to seeing everybody soon. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks, Jen.